Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In the last episode, we saw the king having a lung removed, and he appeared to be getting better. The queen and the whole family were stressed out about it, as was to be expected. There was joy, though, in that the king and queen got to spend time with their grandkids, while Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were representing the UK in Canada and in Nairobi. Let's see what's going on today. The king was in good spirits and wrote cheerful letters to Sir John Weir to thank him for all the excellent medical care he had given him since 1934, and to Lord Halifax, Chancellor of the Order of the Garter, to whom he described a new form of garter dress that he had devised. On February 5th, he went out shooting rabbits. It was Keeper's Day, a relaxed, informal shoot of the sort he enjoyed. James MacDonald, his servant for 20 years, said later that the king shot superbly and was gay and happy as he had ever seen him. At the end of the afternoon, the king thanked the keepers, and that evening he said, "Well, MacDonald, we'll go after the hares again tomorrow." In the meantime, the Queen and Princess Margaret drove to the nearby village of Ludham to see one of her favorite painters, Edward Seago. He showed them his latest works, and he took them on a cruise on his boat, which was moored in the end of the garden. Warmed by a coal fire in the cabin, they made a happy call on Delia Peel at her house at Barton Turf, and Seago gave the Queen new paintings to show the king. Back at Sandringham that evening, the Queen went at once to see the king, as she always did, and he was in tremendous form and looking so well and happy. Seago's paintings were laid out, and they looked at them together. The Queen told Seago later that the king was enchanted with them all. They had an enjoyable dinner with Princess Margaret, and the king was cheerful, and his wife was delighted. At around 10:30 p.m. they said goodnight, and the king retired to the ground floor room he was now using as a bedroom, so he could avoid taking the stairs. At around midnight, a watchman in the garden saw him adjusting the new latch, which had been fitted to his window to allow more air into the room. At 7:30 a.m., MacDonald brought the king early morning tea, opened the curtains, and drew a bath. When the king didn't stir, he went to his bedside. The king was lying peacefully. He had not moved from his usual position, and there were no signs of discomfort. MacDonald shook his shoulder gently. He didn't get a response, so he touched his forehead, which was cold. He knew the king was dead. He immediately sent word to the Queen's dresser and went himself to report to Sir Harold Campbell, the king's equerry. The Queen wrote to Queen Mary a few hours later, "I was sent a message that his servant couldn't wake him. So I flew to his room and thought that he was in deep sleep. He looked so peaceful, and then I realized what had happened." Lascelles called Edward Ford, the assistant private secretary in London, and told him the news, and then asked him to go to the Prime Minister and to Queen Mary. Ford told Churchill, "I've got bad news, Prime Minister," and he said, "The king died last night. I know nothing else." And Churchill said, "Bad news? The worst." Later, Churchill's secretary, Jacques Colville, found the Prime Minister sitting with tears in his eyes, staring straight ahead. He tried to cheer him up by saying that he would get on well with the new queen, but all he could say was that he did not know her and that she was only a child. Next, Ford went to tell Queen Mary. Jacques Colville's mother, Lady Cynthia, was in waiting, and she went to Queen Mary's room to give her the news. Queen Mary seemed to sense the news and asked Lady Cynthia, "Is it the king?" Later that day, she wrote in her diary, "I got a dreadful shock when Cynthia asked to see me at 9:30 after breakfast to tell me that darling Bertie had died in his sleep early today. The news came out about 10:30. Later, letters kept arriving and flowers from kind friends." At Sandringham, Lascelles let Queen Elizabeth read the announcement and see if it was okay with her, and he made it as simple as possible. And it said, "The king, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep early this morning. The king's body was moved in its coffin on a cart to the little family church where his father had lain 16 years before him. In the streets of London, people stopped their cars and stood at attention in the streets to show their respect. Many wept openly. In America, the House of Representatives unanimously carried a resolution of sympathy and adjourned in the respect for the king." That same day, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary, "My darling Mamma, what can I say to you? I know that you love Bertie dearly, and he was my whole life, and one can only be deeply thankful for the utterly happy years we had together. He was so devoted to you and admired and loved you. It is impossible for me to grasp what has happened. Last night he was in wonderful form and looked so well. It's hard to grasp. He was such an angel to the children and me, and I cannot bear to think of Lilibet, so young to bear such a burden. I do feel for you so, darling Mamma. To lose 2 dear sons, and Bertie so young still, and so precious, it is almost more than one can bear. Your very loving Elizabeth. Queen Mary thanked dear darling Elizabeth for her wonderful letter to poor old me. Queen Mary said, I cannot get over the fearful shock you must have had when you realized that he had died in his sleep. You have been such a wonderful wife to him, in weal and woe, and such a prop when things were a little difficult, and he was upset. This must be a comfort to you and your great grief, and I feel this very much indeed. In Kenya, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were horrified at every level. There was grief, and it was mingled with the knowledge that this was the end of their independent life together. On the plane ride home, Martin Chatteris asked his employer what name she would take as monarch. My own name, of course. What else? She replied. She would be Queen Elizabeth II. Shortly before the plane landed, she changed into black mourning clothes that she had traveled with her just in case of such an eventuality. As the plane taxied to a halt, she saw the big black palace cars, and she said, Oh, they sent the hearses. That was the name she and her sister had always used for the royal limousines. She was met by Churchill at the airport. There with him was Attlee, Eden, and other political leaders. She and Prince Philip managed a few smiles and then climbed into one of the hearses, and Churchill in his own car was in tears as he drove back to London, dictating a radio broadcast that he was to make that night. He spoke of the king as a devoted and tireless servant of his country, and that the announcement of his death struck a deep and solemn note in our lives, which, as it resounded far and wide, stilled the clatter and traffic of the 20th century life in many lands and made countless millions of humans being pause and look around them. Churchill declared that the king had walked with death as if death were a companion he did not fear. In the end, death became a friend, and after a happy day of sunshine and sport, and after a good night to those who loved him best, he fell asleep as every man or woman who strives to fear God and nothing else in the world may hope to do. Churchill also said that Queen Elizabeth was ascending the throne at the same age as the first Queen Elizabeth, nearly 400 years earlier. He ended by saying, God save the Queen. After the new Queen arrived at Clarence House, one of her first visitors was Queen Mary. Her old granny and subject must be the first to kiss her hand, she said. Queen Mary was 84, and she had lived through 5 reigns, and she curtsied to the new queen. The queen knew what a responsibility her granddaughter had taken at the age of 25, but she said she has a fine, steadfast character. She wrote to Queen Elizabeth and will, I know, always do her best for our beloved country and her people all over the world, and dear Philip will be a great help. Elizabeth II and Prince Philip drove to Sandringham. The new queen understood that the loss of the king was especially terrible for her mother and sister to bear. Queen Elizabeth was calm, too calm, felt those around her. She began to reply to the many thousands of letters which were sent to her. Until February 11th, the king's coffin lay in the church at Sandringham, draped in the royal standard and watched over by the estate workers at all times. On the morning of the 11th, it was conveyed on the same gun carriage that had borne his father's coffin to Wolverton Station, where it was then taken to London. At King's Cross Station, the young queen, her grandmother, her mother, and her sister were photographed standing in deepest black, head bowed and darkly veiled, as they watched the coffin of the man they had loved so long being taken from the train. The king's body lay in state for the next 4 days in Westminster Hall, while more than 300,000 people dressed in their best somber clothes waited quietly in the winter cold, in lines 4 miles long, to pass by and pay their respects to the unexpected king, whom they had come to love and depend on. For at least a month, millions of people wore black mourning armbands. On Friday, February the 15th, the king's coffin was taken to Windsor and brought on a gun carriage drawn by officers and ratings of HMS Excellent to St. George's Chapel in the castle, where the funeral was held. Winston Churchill's wreath read simply, "For valor." That evening, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Lascelles, "Today has been the most wonderful and most agonizing day of my life. Wonderful because one felt the sincerity of the people's feelings, and agonizing because of the gradually one becomes less numb and the awfulness of everything becomes real." This was a sad video because the king looked like he was on his way to recovery. It was great that he had a good few days before his death and that he died peacefully in his sleep. It must have been so hard for the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and Princess Elizabeth to deal with the loss of a husband and father they had loved so dearly. They were so close, being the wee four and then the five when Prince Philip married into the family. The country truly mourned the man who never thought he would have to take the throne, and he did a magnificent job and served his country and his people well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it will continue to help the channel out. I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.